The film starts in Antarctica, where an American scientific team led by Dr. Jack is doing some research. All of a sudden, a large shelf starts to break, and Jack has to jump over a deadly ridge to retrieve the priceless data of their research. He almost falls into the ridge in the process, but his colleagues grab him. A few months later, he's speaking at an international environmental conference. He explains how global warming and polar cap melting are destroying the salt balance of the ocean. This can affect the North Atlantic currents, which warm our northern hemisphere. He believes it can all lead to an ice age in the next 100 years if we don't stop global warming. His remarks don't sit well with the US Vice President, who thinks that it's all sensational rhetoric, but Jack shuts him up. After the conference, Jack meets with Professor Terry, who studies ocean currents and shares Jack's fears. In Tokyo, things are already looking grim as all of a sudden, ice cubes larger than bricks start coming down, causing havoc. In Washington, Jack calls his ex-wife and she asks him to drive his son Sam to the airport tomorrow because Sam is participating in a decathlon in New York. However, the next day Jack gets caught up in work and barely manages to pick up Sam in time. While Sam is boarding the airplane, the astronauts at the International Space Station notice a storm brewing over the US. Sam's plane gets caught in this storm, and he holds his friend Laura's hand as the turbulence causes chaos in the plane. However, they safely reach New York. While stuck in morning traffic, Sam's friend Simon suggests walking to their destination. This is when they notice all the birds leaving the city. Even animals in the zoo are acting strangely. In England, Terry notices some ocean buoys showing a 13-degree temperature drop, and this isn't normal. He calls Jack and explains that the North Atlantic current is acting the same way that Jack predicted. Jack has an older Ice Age model that can predict future weather scenarios, and Terry wants him to use it. Meanwhile, in Los Angeles, people wake up to a stormy day where it's hailing like never before. Large tornadoes are forming over the city, declaring imminent danger. Jack, however, is arguing with his boss to let him make his model, but his boss doesn't think it's necessary. This is when they see the news where a tornado destroys the Hollywood sign. The giant torpedoes are erasing everything in their path, and even a news reporter becomes a victim. By the time the tornadoes leave, Los Angeles has been destroyed beyond recognition. After seeing this, the president grounds all aircraft in the country. This news worries Sam and his friends who are stuck in New York. Jack, on the other hand, is attending an emergency meeting in Washington, where the authorities are learning about the strange weather all over the world. They don't know what's causing this, but Jack thinks that it's due to the North Atlantic currents. After hearing this, Jack's boss allows him to make the weather model, so Jack starts working. His colleagues give him the reports that night, and Jack is horrified to learn that the world is going to freeze in the upcoming weeks. He calls Sam and asks him to come back, but Sam says he'll get on a train the next day. A local student named JD has a crush on Laura, and he offers them a place to stay. The next day, Jack shows his findings to the vice president and asks for immediate evacuations of the northern states. The vice president doesn't take Jack seriously at all. However, things are getting pretty serious in Scotland, where army helicopters are trying to rescue people stuck in the snow. This is when the fuel in these helicopters freezes up and they crash to the ground. When the survivors try to escape, they freeze to death instantly. Terry tells Jack how the temperature dropped to minus 144 degrees Fahrenheit in that region for a few minutes. He sends all the data to Jack to get future predictions. In New York, Sam and his friends are trying to get out of the city, but the streets are flooded and they soon realize that they're not going anywhere. In the zoo, the authorities learn that all the wolves have escaped and they are now roaming the streets. The streets are also filled with cars, and Sam decides to take shelter in the library because the water level is rising. On their way, Laura cuts herself on some metal. This is when she sees a police officer trying to rescue a family that doesn't speak English. She helps the officer, who gets the family out of the cab, but Laura goes back to grab the woman's passport. This is exactly when a giant tsunami wave passes by the Statue of Liberty and enters the city. It's destroying everything in its path, and Sam sees it approaching. He runs to get Laura, who starts running after seeing the wave. They make it into the library as the wall of water drowns everything around it. In England, Terry receives a call from Jack, who describes how 3 giant storms are going to freeze the entire northern hemisphere in the next 10 days. It's essentially the start of the next ice age. Terry knows at this point that his team isn't going to be able to survive this storm, but he asks Jack to save as many people as possible. After the call, Jack learns about the situation in New York. He tries to call Sam, but the lines are down. However, Sam is a smart guy who knows that payphones work even without electricity, so he goes to the lower floor, which is flooded. He somehow calls his parents, and Jack uses this opportunity to tell his son that he shouldn't try to go outside because the upcoming storm will freeze anything that's not near a heating source. He also promises to get to Sam as soon as he can. This is when Sam has to leave. He makes it back to Laura, who's freaking out. Sam is freezing at the moment, and she warms him up. That evening, people in the library hear something outside. They look out to see a giant ship slowing down after hitting a bus in the streets. In Washington, Jack is giving the president a rundown of the situation. He suggests evacuating everyone in the southern U.S. to Mexico. He believes people in the north should stay inside and try to ride out the storm. The vice president is doubting Jack's motives for suggesting this, but he shuts up after hearing that Jack's son is in New York. As the president starts evacuations, Jack gets ready to get his son, and his colleagues are hell-bent on going with him. The news of evacuations reaches New York, where people are walking on the snow to get to the south. The people in the library notice it and decide to do the same. Sam tries to warn them about going outside, but only a handful of people listen to him. After everyone leaves, the librarian shows the remaining people a cozy reading room. There's a fireplace and they decide to burn books to stay alive. They also find some food in the vending machines. While they're getting ready to face the storm, Jack and his team get stuck outside of Philadelphia. They have to walk the rest of the way. In the library, Sam and Laura are chatting, and he tells her that his best memory was a trip that he took with his father, where they were stuck for 10 days. He even expresses his feelings for her that night. Meanwhile, Jack is walking through the frozen landscape when all of a sudden, a member of his team falls through a glass roof. They're trying to get him out, but the glass around them is shattering. Jack's friend sees this, and he cuts the rope to save others, while Jack begs him not to. In Washington, the president is among the last people to evacuate, but the next morning the vice president learns that the president's motorcade got stuck in the storm, and he didn't make it. In New York, things are getting worse as well. The people walking on the streets are dying due to the cold, while Laura has also become sick. They find out that a cut on her leg got infected. She's going into septic shock and needs antibiotics immediately. Jack is also struggling because his colleague just collapses due to the extreme cold. As the storm approaches New York, Sam decides to check the ship for medicine, but Simon and JD won't let him go alone. As they're walking onto the ship, the wolves find their scent and start following them. Sam eventually finds the medicine room, but it's locked, so he has to enter the room through the window. They find penicillin inside, and Sam wants to leave immediately. However, his friends want to search the ship for food. While they're searching, the wolves enter the room and the predators quickly grab JD's leg. Sam has to beat the wolf to save JD, but they're practically stuck in the room. To make things worse, Sam can see the eye of the storm approaching, and he knows they have to leave. So he goes out and lures the wolves toward the exit. He barely manages to evade certain death. He then quickly goes back to the mess hall and decides to use an inflatable boat to drag all the food and JD back to the library. While they're leaving, Sam sees the cold air freezing the top of the skyscrapers. While Sam rushes to get inside, Jack is also reaching the outskirts of New York. He can also see the approaching danger, so he pushes his unconscious friend into the air vent of a kitchen and jumps behind him. He then turns on all the stoves inside the kitchen to protect himself from the freezing cold. Sam also runs back to the reading room and locks the door. He makes sure that the fire doesn't go out, otherwise they'll all freeze to death. When Jack's colleague wakes up, Jack tells him to get ready because he's eager to find his son. They trek through the frozen landscape and see all the dead people who tried to escape the city. That night, Jack tells his colleague that he can't give up his pursuit because he made a promise to his son and he really wants to keep it. His luck finally turns around because the storm is dissipating. Jack wakes up the next day to find sunlight around him along with frozen ships. He walks through the city and reaches the point where the library should be, but all he can see is ice. He still doesn't lose hope and looks around. That's when he sees the entrance to the library. They both go inside and eventually find the reading room. They can't believe their eyes when they see Sam sleeping inside comfortably along with all the other people. The news of Jack's success reaches the vice president, who has now become the leader of the US. He addresses the world, explaining how mankind abused the resources of our planet and caused this nightmare. He also orders a rescue mission to save the survivors in the northern US. Pretty soon, the helicopters reach New York, where they can see Jack and others walking on the ice. Sam is over the moon after seeing so many survivors standing on top of the skyscrapers. The film ends with the astronauts looking at the Earth as the weather finally clears.